Hey, this is Tom, the homeless teacher, and I'm here with Ian DeYoung of Ord Code. Thank you, Ian, for being here.
Thanks, Tom, for having me. Glad to be here.
So we're going to discuss shelter procedures and kind of what's happening in Daytona because we've had a little discussion about a plan the city of Daytona wants to do, and I wanted to ask you some questions about it if I could.
Sure.
So the first question is, I know in the city of Pensacola we've moved all the homeless services out of downtown and it really didn't affect their homeless problem too well. And that's kind of the city of Daytona's mindset as they're trying to get the services out of downtown. But what are the issues with having a shelter type facility such as this that far away from the core area?
Here's a really great example of life where service matters and location matters relative to service. So, if we were to put any facility for people of low or no income that's outside the core, it begs certain questions. And the obvious ones are things around things like transportation or where are people going to get fed or what are the services they're going to use. But let's ask the critical question relative to homelessness. How is that going to help any person experiencing homelessness get out of homelessness any better? If you don't actually have housing and supports that are located close to where you're serving people, all you're going to do is manufacture a shrine, a multi-million-dollar shrine that will have more and more homelessness and less solutions.
Do you think it's so? I think what they would say to that, and I'm just playing devil's advocate, what the city would say to that is, yeah, we're trying to serve the population that Housing First doesn't work for.
Which population is that? Because I would love to know from the evidence and the peer-reviewed empirical data who exactly that is that they're talking about that say that Housing First doesn't work. I mean, let's be clear. Housing First is perhaps the most reviewed process relative to housing and has been proven to outperform all other approaches. So to say that there's a population group for whom Housing First doesn't work, show me a peer-reviewed study that demonstrates and articulates who that population is.
Well, the population they're talking about are people that don't want help because, there's this myth, and it's not just in the city of Daytona. I think it proliferates all throughout the United States that there's this big population of people that want to be homeless. So those are the people they're talking about, the ones that want to be homeless.
Well, the problem with that, and I hear the perception, it comes across a lot. Most often, again, if you look into the research and even some work that I've done on point in time counts and such over time and published research, it's not that most people don't want housing. Is that they don't necessarily want the housing with all the rules that are being offered locally. And so we really need to pull that apart. If you look at and it works out to approximately 10% that say that they don't want housing, more than half of those don't want housing because a service provider told them that they weren't ready for housing. Of the remaining approximately 5%, you have a certain percentage that are already on a waiting list for housing. It's not that they don't want housing, they just don't want to lose a spot on a waiting list if they were to accept housing now. There's a small percentage that are so profoundly mentally ill and or unable to communicate in English that we don't know their intention. That's about 1 and a bit percent. And there's about 1 and a bit percent that are truly making an informed decision to be homeless. So if someone says 1 out of every 100 persons experiencing homelessness is making a deliberate choice to stay outside, I'd buy that. Heck,
That's about accurate.
I might even buy 2. But to say that there's this large volume of people, it's not that the people don't want housing, it's that you're offering the wrong housing or you're offering it in the wrong way.
And the highest research I have seen, and not even talking about that, in other words, just people going out and asking, the highest research I can find is 6 to 8%. And then that's not even asking the critical question of housing without all the strings.
Yeah.
That's just asking, do you want to stay homeless? It's only 6 or 8%. So,
well, and there's this other myth, which I think we shouldn't lose track of, and this mythology that if we build this super facility, it's going to be exactly what everybody wants, and they're going to go forth and use it. And so, because there's this group that no one can articulate with data, they're going to want this thing if we actually build it because Housing First isn't working. And I will ask, under which legal authority are you going to remove people from a downtown and force them to go get services somewhere else?
well, the thing about it is the truth be told, in a lot of cities, and I'm not trying to throw any particular city under the bus, a lot of times it's not what the homeless need or what the city needs to improve the homeless problem. It's more about how do we get a quick fix and become Pottinger compliant.
Well, and that's when we can then start to point the finger back at people experiencing homelessness and say, look what we did for you, and you chose not to use it. Therefore, all people should have no empathy, no sympathy, and no desire to help out anybody. Those people have made their own absence of bed, and they should lie in it. And that's, truth be told, When we get to a blaming place, we lose our resiliency when it comes to solving complex social issues. We want things to be reduced to simple solutions and sound bites, and most cities want to have at least one other place that's figured it out exactly and gone forward. I mean, this is part of the miracle that is Dr. Marvitt. He will cite these false statistics about all these places that have ended homelessness using his method, and I would say, show me one of those places.
And you know, you brought up Dr. Marvitt, because I'll just simply say that in the Florida communities, all the Florida communities, that's Sarasota, that's Leesburg, that's Orlando, that's every place that Dr. Marvitt has tried to rear his ugly head. I have been there, and people think I have something personal against Dr. Marvitt, when in truth is, you just said the same thing I say, that his statistics are fake.
Well, I think a statistic actually has a merit of fact to it, and certainly I've never seen, nor any of my esteemed colleagues and researchers who do this for a living, who can actually support any of the statistics that he cites on a regular basis. And yet, he will get the ear of elected officials and the business community. He will spin a tale of, as we've talked about, fear, and he will prey off those fears to try to get people inspired to do things. What he can't actually prove, and what has never been peer-reviewed, is any legitimacy to any of the claims. Is that really any different than the infomercial at 3 o'clock in the morning with someone who's trying to sell you a miracle pill that's going to cause you to lose all sorts of weight, when really the science is completely different than what they're spinning in the yard of 3 o'clock in the morning infomercial? I think Dr. Marvitt...
We know the answer to that.
Yeah, Dr. Marvitt is the infomercial in search of truth. And there's no truth to anything that he says.
And you know, you talked about one of the other things that he proliferates is, if you build a great homeless service program, all the homeless are going to flock to your program. And I think that's hilarious. You know, the whole "if you build it, they will come" thing. I know in Pinellas County here, they have a law that says if you have not been in the county 6 months, you can't get any homeless services. You have to prove you've been a resident. And that's a byproduct of the Marvitt thing, that if you build Volusia Safe Harbor, you know, everybody's going to come to use your facility. But the truth is there any truth to build it and they will come?
No. I mean, if there's any truth, it's very small. If you, again, look at studies that have been done, and I'll say especially in warmer climates across the country, because if you build it, they will come is much more prevalent in places like Southern California and Texas and Florida. Is it when you get down and interview people experiencing homelessness, most of them have been housed at some point in that community. In other words, it's not like any other American that has freedom of mobility and can move across the country and set up residence.
They can't just buy a bus ticket and say, hey, you know, Florida's got some great homeless services, think I'll head down there.
And the truth of the matter is, if you go to places like Michigan or Minnesota or North Dakota, well, any of the Dakotas really, you go there in the dead of winter, you're still going to see homeless, and you're still going to see homelessness outside. And you ask me, if someone really was of the "if you build it, they will come" mentality, don't you think every single person in a cold climate would have come south?
I would agree with that. And the other thing that we have going on, you know, in relation to this whole Dr. Marvitt thing, is no measures of success.
Nothing.
In other words, you know, the measure of success, and I know you and I have the same mindset. How much money did you spend? And how many people did you get out of homelessness? That would be a good measure of success.
It's a really good one.
And so the measures of success of, we fed 8,000 people, or we had 300 stay overnight, you know, a day or whatever, those are just measures of perpetuating homelessness in my eyes.
They are. So there's three metrics that really matter at the end of the day. In any community, whether they are, you know, in the infancy of setting up a new program or looking at a new shelter like the city of Daytona is, or whether they're evaluating the long-standing services in their city or county, it comes down to these three metrics. How long is a household remaining homeless? So what's the length of time that it takes someone to get out of homelessness?
How long they've been in the shelter, basically.
Yeah, or it could be touched throughout
or
street
program,
outreach, etc.
Yeah.
But how long has a person been homeless before they move into housing? The second metric is how many people are moving into permanent housing, and I want to stress the word permanent there. So not a transitional program, not what's known as a grant and per diem program in the veterans world, but how many people are moving into permanent place, so no reason to believe they ever have to move if they follow the conditions of their lease. And the third metric is, of all the people that you supported and in moving into housing, how many came back into homelessness?
And while we're talking about metrics, I want to throw, and believe me, if I'm wrong, do not have any problem shooting me down. the thing that I'm looking at, especially in the Florida communities, is when you look at any nonprofit that's running a family shelter or a single shelter, whatever you're running, you know, first thing I ask them is, do you have a wait list? And if you have a wait list, where are the people waiting?
Mm-hmm.
Then the second thing I always ask them, and because that tells me if they have a wait list and people are staying in their shelter a long time, then obviously they're not a successful shelter. If people are there 6 months, a year, 2 years, and what they do to a lot of them is they'll say, "Oh, you've been here 6 months, you got to get out, and you can come back again in 3 months," or whatever, all those rules. But the point simply is that first I ask them, if they have a wait list and where people are waiting. Then I ask them the length of time that their family or the individual has been in the shelter. I ask them, how many people have you kicked out of the shelter, and how many people have you denied services? The final question is how many people you've gotten into homes. So are there anything that I missed in there or I was incorrect in asking there to evaluate a shelter?
Well, we could certainly be. So the only other thing that I would maybe add is a dimension of quality of service. So getting people into housing is really good. Was it done in a way that people found to be respectful and honoring of their trauma and their experience and building on their strengths rather than their weaknesses? I mean, there's a lot of shelters that are like tear people down, build them back up model rather than focusing on the strengths that people come with. So that'd be the only piece I'd add. There's another part of evaluating shelters on the broader perspective, though, that I think we need to look at, which is the things that shelters provide that are not necessary. There's some that are...
Are you talking about a bunch of services being in the shelter?
Yeah, so like a budgeting course you have to go to, or a life skills program, or if you attend, you have to go to an AA meeting, or there are a number of Christian shelters that require some sort of participation in Bible study or a discipleship program, etc. None of which actually end the person's homelessness. And again, it's been well proven, if you want to end homelessness, get them into a home and then wrap supports around them, as opposed to trying to get people supported up so that they're in a position to move into housing. And there's lots of shelters that I would say are guilty of therapeutic incarceration. This belief that if I just hold on to you a little bit longer, I'll make you a little bit more ready for it.
Responsible, yeah.
And just quite simply doesn't work that way. I think also, though, it begs a question when a community is thinking about a new shelter, what is it that they actually want out of that shelter? You need to design programs and the desired outputs and outcomes to inform the location and the design of the actual built facility. And what you can see in a lot of places, either they take over buildings and then try to adapt them into shelters, or they start with a parcel of land, which is most often derelict brownfield or well outside where the proximity to services. But they don't start with how is this going to get people out of homelessness. It starts with what is the facility supposed to do and where should we put it. From a planning perspective, you start with need and then adapt to design. You don't start with design and then try to figure out what needs it meets.
And let me say this. That's one of the things that's happening in a lot of communities is they'll use different numbers. Different people will use different numbers to push their own agenda. So, for example, we know the school system's number is completely different than the point in time count number because it's done under different parameters. But the number, if I'm correct, that we should use if we're going to build a shelter for chronically single folks would be the number of single men and women that are unsheltered in the point in time count. Is that a good start? I know that's not a be-all, end-all number, but...
Well, that's going to tell you or give you some sense of on any given night, which is what a point in time count does. It's not exhaustive of the total volume of people that experience homelessness in a year, but on any given night, how many chronically homeless, unattached men and women do we experience? That would give you some sense of what the overall capacity would be. Now, if you wanted to target to say, and I'm going to make up some numbers here, not based on anything, but let's say the number was 300 in the community. You might say, well, we are really shooting to get that number down to 250 over the next 2 years. So we're going to build a shelter for 250, which accepts some of that maybe 6 to 8%, as you discussed, the 1 to 2% that I talked about that isn't going to go in, but then also have a complementary street outreach strategy that's going to try to help people get housed directly from the street and not even have to go to a shelter in the first place. I would say that as we think about capacity and the desire for shelter, we always have to think that a shelter is a process, a shelter is not a destination. And a shelter is a process by which people get housed again. That's its purpose. But if we see shelter as a destination, if we see it as a place for people to go, or if businesses or downtown folks say it's a place to send people experiencing homelessness, that doesn't end homelessness. Flat out. All you're doing is trying to hide the condition, which I will guarantee you will result in more people being in a position of need downtown because you're not dealing with both in and outflow at the same time.
And, I've seen many cities, for example, Orlando, before they really got involved in the Housing First model, had 3 shelters there. They had the Salvation Army, they had the Mission, and they had that brand new facility by the Central Florida I'm trying to remember the name of the organization, but they had 3 shelters with about 400 or 500 beds, but they weren't in any way helping their homeless problem until they started using good practices. And now they reduced 28% last year on the point in time count, over the course of the year, and that's a huge number. 30%.
Yeah.
Huge.
So once you become data driven, I think Orlando is a good example of a community becoming data driven. Again, it's not just about the housing number and the reduction, though that's important. It's also a matter of targeting to house the right people. And it's the same way that people start to wrap their heads around emergency medicine. At some point we've got to realize we're never going to have the perfect number of doctors and nurses on staff at any given point in time to deal with what come in, and we don't want people waiting around, but we also don't want a whole bunch of issues with people waiting forever. So how do you get to a place where you can prioritize and make sure you're serving the right people? That's ultimately the question.
Well, I want to tell everybody in the listening audience out there that I'm talking with Ian Jong, who is the creator of one half of the VI SPDAT, the Vulnerability Index portion. And that's the assessment tool that we use all throughout the nation to assess folks on an annual basis for the housing and urban development. And so we get a lot of data from your tool there, Ian, and your tool gives people a number, and explain to people why we need that number and what we use it for.
So the point of having any sort of triage or assessment tool is try to figure out how do I get the right person to the right service in the right order. So there's 3 things that we need to look at. So the right person in the right order to the right service usually means a person that has a really deep needs, they're going to need a type of housing that has a lot of supports wrapped around in it. A person with a moderate need is probably going to need some sort of time-limited support, so maybe 3 to 6 months of support and they'll be fine. But also identifying those people that aren't going to need supports to get out of homelessness, and they are like what all the data and literature, the peer-reviewed academic literature would show, are people that are going to get themselves out of homelessness on their own. So what we need to do is focus our efforts and our resources on those who do need assistance, not those who don't need assistance. And then the number is a way of making sure that we're putting people in at least buckets of need, right? It's high need, moderate need, low need. And from those different buckets can start to say, what money do we want to allocate in our community, let's say, to the individuals or the percentage of individuals that have really deep needs. So that's often chronically homeless persons. And we can make up some figures, we could drive our data. What you start to see is like about 30% of our money, at least, should be going to people experiencing chronic homelessness. But then you'll find a lot of communities, 50% or more of people are ones that have moderate needs, that need some sort of time-limited assistance. So maybe we need to start thinking about, well, what resources we want to go into that. And when we start having these resource-based conversations that are driven by data, we get much better community planning. Community planning relative to our strategies that will end homelessness, as opposed to just our documents that we hope will result in a reduction of homelessness. And this is where, from the VI SPDAT perspective, it's been transformative in getting communities to think beyond first come, first served, and into an idea of prioritization of resource. And that's probably been the fundamental shift that's occurred through the creation of the tool. Really grateful to see communities starting to use data in a way to drive that, and to make much more informed decisions about who's going to get support. But it also allows us to get beyond the sample size of one and get beyond anecdote. And this is something you'll see across the country, whether it's a service provider, nonprofit organization, elected official, or even an advocate or activist, and certainly you have some of those in Florida, who will spin a tale relative to how they want people to think homelessness is versus what the data actually shows. So most organizations, for example, want you to believe they're the only ones who serve the hardest of the hard to serve, until you actually have data that can prove that may not be the case, or someone else has serving just as many people with high needs, or an activist that wants you to believe there's a whole bunch of people being left behind in the programs and policies that are put in place, until the data shows that simply isn't true.
Right.
So you got to focus on the data, because that's where the truth is, and the truth should guide where your money and investment goes.
And this is Tom Redmond, the homeless teacher. We'll be right back after this break.